The handcuffs go on at 3:47 p.m. in a public park on a Friday afternoon in front of anyone who happened to be looking. And the man they belong to, he doesn't struggle, doesn't shout, doesn't do any of the things you'd expect from someone being arrested on a bench where he was, minutes ago, doing nothing more dangerous than reading a book. He just turns around, slowly, deliberately, like a man who has done this before, like a man who knew, from the moment the shadow crossed the grass, exactly how this afternoon was going to end. The officer leans in close. "You should have just cooperated," he says, satisfied. The voice of a man who believes he has won something. The man in handcuffs says nothing, just looks at him. With the patience of something the officer doesn't. Something that is going to change everything. In about 45 minutes, he wasn't doing anything wrong. That was the part that stayed with him, not the handcuffs, not the patrol car, not the 43 seconds that would eventually be watched by people he'd never meet, in places he'd never been, on phones held in hands he'd never shake. Just that. He wasn't doing anything wrong, and it happened anyway. Dion Mays had been carrying the same paperback for 6 weeks. James Baldwin. Dog-eared somewhere in the middle of chapter 11, which was where it had been since the Tuesday before last and the Tuesday before that, because every time he opened it at his desk, he fell asleep within 20 minutes. Not because the book was boring, because his body had learned to treat any surface that wasn't a briefing room chair as an invitation to shut down completely. He closed his laptop at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, stood up, put on his jacket, walked out before anyone could say his name. His supervisor, Barrett, looked up from the copy machine as Dion passed, opened his mouth, reconsidered. Barrett was a practical man. He understood there were moments when the correct response to something was to let it go by, and this was one of them. Dion didn't check his phone in the elevator, didn't turn on the radio when he got to his car, just drove. He knew where he was going before he admitted it to himself. North on Delaney. Left on 58th. Past the hardware store his father used to do take-and-pow on Saturday mornings. The one with the hand-lettered sign that had been faded for 20 years, and somehow never got more faded. Past the elementary school with the green fence, same chipped paint, same crooked latch on the main gate, like time had simply stopped showing up to that particular block. Harlan Square. He found a parking spot on the street, pulled out 2 hours' worth of quarters and fed the meter. Enough for 2 hours, which felt like enough. He wasn't planning to stay long. He was planning to read a few pages, breathe some air that wasn't recirculated through a federal building's HVAC system, and drive home before the evening traffic had thickened on Delaney. That was the plan. He walked through the iron gate that needed oiling and had needed it since he was a child. The park was small. It had always been small, 3 benches, a walking path that looped around a sandbox nobody used anymore. 2 oak trees that were old when Dion was young, a bulletin board near the entrance with a flyer for a church bake sale, and another one for a lost cat named Biscuit, the paste soft and starting to curl at the corners. He sat on the middle bench, opened the book, read the first sentence of chapter 11 3 times before it held. Then something in him loosened, not dramatically, not all at once, just a quiet release, like a knot pulled so tight for so long that he'd forgotten it was there until the moment it let go. He read. The afternoon moved around him at its own pace. A woman walked a dog with a bandaged paw, the animal moving with great dignity despite its situation. 2 old men set up a chess board at the far end of the path with the efficiency of people who had done this so many times the ritual no longer required conversation. A kid on a bicycle circled the sandbox twice, assessed it, found it wanting, and pedaled away. Dion turned a page. Then another. He didn't think about the case he'd closed 3 days ago. Didn't think about the reports on his desk. Didn't think about the deposition scheduled for Monday, or the fact that he hadn't called his sister Keisha back in 11 days. He just read. And for a little while, in the amber light of a Friday afternoon in a park 6 blocks from where he grew up, that was enough. He did not think about the meter running out. 2 hours felt like more than enough. It would not be. Roy Callahan had been on his feet since 7 that morning. That was normal. He didn't mind it. 24 years on the job had made his standing his default state. Sitting felt like yielding something, though he couldn't have named exactly what or to whom. He walked his beat the way he always did. Steady, methodical, eyes moving in the pattern he'd developed so long ago it was no longer a decision but a reflex. Most people didn't notice how much he watched. That suited him. Watching was the job. The morning had run quiet. A noise complaint on Fairfield that turned out to be a teenager practicing drums, genuinely trying. A fender bender on 6th that the drivers sorted out before he arrived, both exchanging information on the hood of one car with the resigned efficiency of people who had better things to do. A woman locked out of her car who'd thanked him so genuinely it almost made the drive over worth it. Almost. The alert had come in at 11:15. Robbery suspect, Harlan District, male, black, mid-40s, dark jacket. 4 data points that describe several hundred men in a 6-block radius on any given afternoon. Callahan knew that. Some corner of his mind knew it clearly. But the information settled into him anyway. The way things settle when they feel useful, even before you can say why. Even before you've examined whether they actually are. By 3 o'clock, he was walking the perimeter of Harlan Square. He was unconsciously thinking about the alert. He was thinking about whether his knee would hold through the rest of the shift. He was thinking about the transmission noise his car had been making since last week. The kind that starts small and becomes expensive if you ignore it long enough. He was thinking that the oak trees here needed trimming and wondering, as he always did when he passed this park, whose job that actually was and why it never seemed to get done. And then he saw the man on the bench. Black man, mid-40s, dark jacket. Something clicked, not a sound, not a formed thought. Just a shift like a door settling into its frame. Roy Callahan had trusted that click for 24 years. He walked closer. The man was reading. Completely still, one ankle crossed over the opposite knee, the book open in his lap, the posture of someone with nowhere pressing to be. Someone unbothered by the afternoon, by the park, by anything visible. That bothered Callahan more than it should have. He didn't stop to look at why. Dion felt the shift before he heard the footsteps. A change in the quality of the afternoon. A shadow that didn't match the angle of the trees. He looked up from the page without hurrying, without any visible change in his posture. The officer was crossing the grass toward him. 50s, white, broad through the shoulders, walking with the forward lean of a man who'd long ago stopped noticing that he's expected things to move out of his way. Hand not on the weapon, but near it. Eyes running over him in a specific way Dion had learned to read before he could drive. Not looking for information. Confirming something already decided. He knew that look. Had known it since he was 14 years old, and it had never once gotten easier. Just more familiar. The way a scar becomes familiar. You stop being surprised by it. You never stop knowing it's there. He closed the book, left his thumb between the pages, put both hands where the officer could see them, and waited. Because this was the part where everything depended on the next 30 seconds going a particular way. Where the wrong movement or the fatherhood could also take a situation that was already unbalanced and send it somewhere much harder to come back from. He was very good at the next 30 seconds. Afternoon, the officer said. Afternoon. The officer's eyes moved over him. Over the bench, over the book, back to his face. Nice day to be out. It is. You from around here? Dion almost let himself smile. Not quite. Grew up about 6 blocks that way. The officer shifted his weight slightly. What's the book? James Baldwin. Nothing moved in the officer's face, which told Dion something, though he couldn't have said exactly what. Mind if I ask what you're up to today? Reading. Just reading. Just reading. The officer's head tilted by a fraction. The movement of a man hearing something just past the edge of what he can make out. We had a report earlier. Robbery suspect. Description matches. I understand how descriptions work, Dion said. quietly. Not sharp, just honest. It landed wrong. He watched it land wrong. The officer's jaw tightened, barely. But there, I'm going to need to see some of D. And here it was. The moment Dion had seen coming from the time the shadow crossed the grass. He had the badge in his jacket. Left side, inside breast pocket. 4 seconds to show it. 4 seconds and the officer would get that look, the deflating look, the recalculating look, and walk away. And Dion would find his page and continue. He'd done exactly that 16 times in 20 years. He'd kept count. But something held him today. Maybe it was the Baldwin. Maybe it was the specific indignity of being interrupted in a park 6 fricks from where he grew up, in a place he'd been coming to since childhood, by a man who had decided what Dion was before he'd said a word. Maybe he just needed to see what the next chapter of this particular story looked like when he didn't skip to the end. So he reached into his back pocket, pulled out his wallet, took out his driver's license, held it out. The officer took it, glanced at it. Mr. Mays. Yes, can you stand up for me? Something moved through Dion's chest. Not fear. He'd been on the other side of fear for a long time. This was something older and heavier. The weight of a thing you've watched coming from a distance and still can't quite believe when it arrives. He stood. Turn around, please. He turned, and Roy Callahan put handcuffs on him. The click of the mechanisms was very loud in the quiet afternoon. One of the old men at the chess table looked up, looked away. The woman with the dog had already gone. There was a boy. Dion noticed him as Callahan began walking him toward the patrol car. 14, maybe 15, red hoodie. Standing near the sandbox with his phone raised. Not moving, not speaking, just watching. Their eyes met for a moment. The boy's face had the look Dion had seen on young faces when something they had already suspected about the world turns out to be real. When the thing they hoped wasn't true proves itself true in front of them, and they realize they didn't actually want to be right. Dion held the boy's gaze for one breath. Then Callahan's hand turned him toward the car, and Harlan's square was on the other side of the glass. The patrol car smelled like burnt coffee and vinyl cleaner. Every precinct vehicle smelled like that. Dion had been in enough of them, though never from this seat. The angles were different back here. The sounds were different. People looked at you differently when your hands were behind your back. Not at your face, at your wrists. Callahan got in, adjusted the mirror, started the engine, did not look at Dion directly, which was interesting. He'd done plenty of looking in the park. They pulled onto Delaney. So, Callahan said. His eyes stayed on the road. Where are you coming from today? The park. Before the park? Work? Where do you work? Dion looked out the window. The hardware store drifted by. Then the elementary school with the green fence. Downtown. Doing what? Federal government. Callahan's hands shifted on the wheel. Small movement, but visible. Which agency? Dion didn't answer. He wasn't being obstructionist. Mostly. He was reading the man in the front seat, the way he'd been trained to read people, watching what Callahan's body said when his voice was trying to say something else. The slight tension across the shoulders. The controlled breathing that was working, a little too hard at being controlled. What he was reading was not certainty. Roy Callahan was afraid. Had been afraid since he crossed the grass, probably. Was afraid now, in his own patrol car, with a man in handcuffs in his back seat, because some functioning part of him had already registered what his pride wasn't ready to admit, that he'd made a mistake. That was the most dangerous thing about a man like Callahan. Not the parts that were wrong. The parts that were almost right. The ones close enough to right that they passed inspection most days. You got family? Callahan asked. Dion turned to look at the back of his head. Why? Just making conversation. Are you? Silence. I have a sister, Dion said finally. I owe her a phone call. Callahan said nothing after that. They drove the rest of the way without speaking. The city moved past the windows. People on sidewalks going about their Friday, the way people do when someone else's Friday has quietly come off its rails. A kid selling water bottles at the corner of 5th and Crane. A woman carrying a dry, cleaned dress in a plastic bag. Dion thought about the book. He'd lost his page when the cuffs went on. Hadn't marked it. The meter was going to run out. 2 hours. He'd put in 2 hours, and this was already taking longer than that. Small things. He focused on the small things. Because the small things were manageable, and the larger thing at this moment was not. The 14th precinct smelled like burnt coffee and copy paper. Every precinct did. Dion had walked into a lot of them over 20 years, but always with a badge and a reason and a handshake waiting somewhere inside. The architecture of that experience was entirely different from this one. The angles, the sounds, the way the room organized itself around you when your hands were behind your back. Callahan guided him through the main door, past the front desk, toward the booking area. 3 people were working the main desk when they came in. One on the phone. One filling out a form with the focused expression of a person trying to finish one thing before the next thing arrived. And one, young, mid-20s, with careful eyes and a pen tucked behind his ear, who looked up when they came through the door. His name badge said Greer. He looked at Callahan first, standard, then at Dion, and something happened in his face. Not dramatic. Not a flinch or a dropped jaw, just a small, specific stillness. The look of a man who has heard a sound he recognizes in a place where he wasn't expecting to hear it. Callahan, Greer said. His voice was even, professionally flat. What we got? Possible suspect. Robbery alert from this morning. Found him at Harlan Square. Name? Mays. Dion Mays. Greer wrote it down. Took the ID Callahan held out. Looked at it. Then looked at Dion. Something moved behind his eyes. Dion watched it happen. The specific process of a person who is trying to remember something they filed away carefully and is now pulling it back out. Let me get this logged, Greer said, and walked toward the inner office. Callahan steered Dion to the processing bench. Told him to sit. Dion sat. Looked at the door where Greer had disappeared and waited. Wade Greer stood in the inner office with both hands flat on top of the filing cabinet. Dion Mays. He said the name in his head twice, then again, 8 months ago. March, multi-agency training seminar at the Federal Building downtown. 3 hours on interview, methodology, and behavioral evidence. Greer had taken 4 pages of notes, more than anyone else in the room, because he was new and the material was genuinely useful, and the instructor had a way of explaining things that made you want to write them down before they escaped. The instructor had been tall. Calm in a way that wasn't passive. It was the calm of someone who had made their decisions about themselves a long time ago and didn't need to revisit them every morning. He had a habit of pausing mid-sentence and letting the room sit in the silence, and everyone in the room understood that the silence wasn't empty. His name was Dion Mays, Supervisory Special Agent, FBI. He was currently sitting handcuffed on a processing bench, 20 feet from where Greer was standing. Okay, so, the straightforward thing, the obvious thing, was to go back out there right now and say, quietly and professionally, that there had been a mistake. 60 seconds, maybe less. The situation could be corrected before it went any further, or he could do what 9 months in this building had trained him to do, which was to locate Sergeant Peterson and let a more senior person make the call. To be new and careful and unobtrusive, the way a new officer was supposed to be until they had enough standing to be something else. He picked up his phone, dialed the Federal Building directory, not because he doubted his memory. He knew exactly who Dion Mays was. But his hands needed something to do while his head caught up to what he already knew. The confirmation was faster than he expected. He stood there for a moment after the line disconnected. Just stood there with the phone at his side. Then the door opened and Lou Peterson leaned in. Peterson, Sergeant. 15 years in the building. Callahan's closest friend on the floor. Doing something useful, Greer, or just visiting the filing cabinet. Greer put the phone in his pocket, logging the intake. Peterson looked at him for a beat that lasted slightly too long. Good. Callahan needs the paperwork. He left. Greer looked at the closed door, picked up his pen, went back out to the desk. Roy Callahan was filling out the incident report. He wrote quickly, the way he always wrote these. His hand knew the shapes before his brain had finished forming the sentences. Suspect observed in proximity to reported robbery area, matching physical description. Non-cooperative when approached. Declined to. He stopped. Scratched out that last fragment. Dion Mays had not been uncooperative. Not by any measure Callahan could write down definite. He had handed over his license when asked. He had stood when asked. He had turned around when asked. He had walked to the car without being told twice. Callahan wrote. Did not immediately produce identification upon request. He'd look at the sentence. What the sentence meant was that Dion Mays had produced his driver's license instead of something else. And Callahan had, what exactly? Decided that a man sitting on a bench reading a book on a Friday afternoon needed to be in handcuffs, because the license he handed over wasn't the right kind of document. He scratched out that sentence too. The paper was getting cluttered. He didn't like cluttered reports. Hey, Greer appeared at his elbow. Quiet, measured. Captain Holt wants to see you. Callahan looked up. About what? She didn't say. Callahan capped his pen. Stood. Looked across the room at Dion Mays, who was sitting with his back straight and his cuffed hands in his lap. Looking at the clock on the wall with an expression that was neither patient nor resigned, but something between the two. Something that had been earned over a long time. That expression had bothered Callahan in the park. It bothered him more now. He walked toward Captain Holt's office. Dion counted the ceiling tiles. 42, 43, if you counted the partial one near the vent. Clearly a replacement from a different batch, slightly brighter, slightly smaller, an afterthought that the ceiling had never quite absorbed. He thought about Keisha. Lived in Charlotte now, had for 3 years. She'd asked him twice in the last month whether he was eating. Not how he was doing. Whether he was eating. That was the Keisha version of saying she was worried about him without leaving him any room to tell her she didn't need to be. He thought about the book. Chapter 11. He'd been on it for 6 weeks. He thought about the boy in the red hoodie. He didn't know the boy's name, but he thought about that face. Eyes that were too old for their age. The phone raised and the body very still, the stillness of someone who understood without being told that moving might change what happened next. The door to Captain Holt's office was visible from the bench. Through the narrow window beside it, he could see a corner of desk, a fraction of a bookshelf. Movement, 2 people, one of them Callahan, though you couldn't hear anything through the glass. He looked at the wall clock. 5:17. The meter would run out. He'd put in 2 hours, and this was going to take longer than 2 hours, and somewhere obscene for streets car was accruing a parking fine that was, in the full accounting of this afternoon, the least interesting problem he had. He leaned his head back against the wall. This was the part they didn't put in any manual. Not the academy. Not the field. Not 20 years of federal work. They taught you the law. They taught you procedure, probable cause, the scaffold system the system was supposed to run on. What they didn't teach you was how it felt to sit in a room and wait for the system to look honestly at itself, to actually see what was there instead of what it preferred to see. They didn't teach it because most of the time, the system didn't. Dion knew that, had known it his entire career, which was itself built on knowing things that were uncomfortable to know and finding ways to work with them anyway. He was betting on something different today. He couldn't have said exactly why. Maybe it was Greer, the way the young man's hand had gone still on the logbook, the way he'd walked away from the desk without acknowledging Callahan, which was a specific kind of deliberate. You built a career on reading that kind of stillness. He closed his eyes, waited. Captain Brenda Holt had come up through 4 precincts across 18 years, which meant she had encountered most situations at least twice. She was not a woman who was easily thrown. Right now, something had shifted behind her composure. Not visibly. She'd been in this role long enough that her face did what she told it to do and nothing else. But internally, behind the steadiness, something had moved when Greer set the intake form on her desk, and she read the name printed in Callahan's handwriting. Dion Mays, SSA, FBI. She read it twice, looked at Greer, looked at the closed door. Where is he? Processing bench. Still cuffed. She set the form down carefully. And Callahan. Finishing the incident report. Smart kid. She was starting to take Greer's measure, and what she was measuring was more than 9 months of experience, suggested. All right, send Callahan in. Then get yourself a glass of water, take the long route, and make sure I have 10 uninterrupted minutes. Greer nodded. Left. When Callahan knocked, she told him to come in. He entered with the posture she recognized from years of watching him. Chest out, chin level, the bearing of a man who moved through the world, assuming it would accommodate him. His hands, though, were doing something careful and deliberate at his sides. His hands always told you what his posture was trying to hide. Captain, Roy. She gestured to the chair. Sit down. He sat. Greer said you needed to see me. Walk me through the arrest. He did. About 4 minutes. She let him finish without interrupting, without writing anything down, without nodding or shaking her head. She simply listened to the account Roy Callahan had assembled about what had happened that afternoon. The version that made sense from Wilson where he was standing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The robbery alert from this morning, she said. Yes, ma'am, which described a male, black, mid-40s, dark jacket. That's correct. Roy. She put both hands flat on the desk. That description applies to several hundred people walking around this district on any given Friday. He shifted, barely. I understand that. But he was sitting in a park. She let that stand on its own. Then I need you to wait outside. I want to explain. Outside, Roy. He stood, walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame without turning around. His voice, when it came, was quieter than she'd heard it in a long time. Did I make a mistake? Holt looked at the form on her desk, at the name. Go wait outside. She found Dion exactly where Greer had said, sitting on the processing bench. Back straight, hands in his lap, looking at the clock on the wall with the expression of a man who has learned to make ways to something other than suffering. Not acceptance. Something more active than that. Something that had been chosen rather than arrived at. She walked over. Mr. Mays. He looked at her. Captain. She had the key already. She unlocked the cuffs without making a speech about it. No preamble. No apology yet. Just the immediate practical fact of removal. Because whatever conversation came next, it wasn't one he should have to sit through with his hands behind his back. He brought his arms forward, rubbed one wrist slowly with the opposite thumb, said nothing. My office, she said. If you're willing. I'm willing. They walked without speaking. Officers at nearby desks glanced up and looked away. Lou Peterson, near the copy machine, glanced up and did not look away. Holt noted that, stored it. She closed the office door. They sat across from each other, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Two people accustomed to reading rooms, now reading each other. I know who you are, she said, and I want to be clear. That's not why I took the cuffs off. He looked at her with the expression of someone paying close attention. You didn't deserve to be in them in the first place, she said, regardless of your title. He was quiet then. I appreciate you saying that, Captain. What do you need from this conversation? He answered without hesitating, quietly, no performance in it. I want the process done correctly, from the beginning. Everything by the book. Even if that means it takes time. Especially then. She opened the folder she'd brought with her, turned it to face him across the desk. He looked down at it. His expression didn't change, but his eyes moved across the page with the careful attention of someone who has learned to read documents for what they reveal rather than what they say. Confirming rather than discovering. 2 complaints against Roy Callahan, filed 18 months apart, both describing stops without documented probable cause. Both closed before any formal review. Both bearing the same signature in the resolution field, Lou Peterson. Dion looked up. I need this in the official record, he said. All of it. It will be, Holt said. She meant it without qualification. She held his gaze so he could decide for himself whether she did. He looked at her for a long moment. The specific assessment of a man deciding whether to extend trust to something that might not hold it. Then he nodded. Once, slowly. "Then let's begin," he said. In the main room, Wade Greer stood at the water cooler. He'd been standing there for 7 minutes. His cup was full. He hadn't moved. He was thinking about Peterson, about the lean in the doorway, about the question, "Doing something useful, Greer?" That wasn't a question. He was thinking about the 4 pages of notes in his top desk drawer, still there. He'd never thrown them out. He was thinking about a man sitting on a processing bench with his hands behind his back, and about what Greer had known, and when he had known it, and what he had done with that knowledge when Peterson appeared in the doorway. He'd been in this building 9 months. He knew what happened to people who created problems for people who had been here 24 years. He had student loans. He had a mother in Ohio who thought he'd finally found his direction. He had learned in 9 months to be invisible in the specific way that kept things smooth. He set the cup down, went to his desk, opened the top drawer, took out a blank incident report form. And in the quiet of a Friday evening, with the day shift winding down around him and the night shift not yet fully arrived, Wade Greer began to write. Not a revision, not a softened version. The thing itself, in the order it happened, with every name attached to every action. 4 sentences that were going to change the next 3 weeks of his life. He wrote them anyway. The clock on the wall said 5:17, then 5:43, then 6:02. In Holt's office, Dion Mays told the story from the beginning, carefully, in sequence, without editorializing. In a plastic chair outside that office, Roy Callahan looked at the floor and tried to locate the exact moment he'd stopped asking himself questions he should have been asking. And at his desk, Wade Greer wrote 4 sentences. None of them knew what the others were doing. But all of it was happening in the same building, on the same Friday evening, within 50 feet of each other. That's how these things work. Not with a confrontation, not with a revelation that arrives complete and explained. Just people in a building, each alone with something true, each deciding, one sentence, one breath, one moment at a time, what to do with it. Outside, Harlan Square was settling into dusk. The chess players had packed their board and gone home. The path was empty. The oak trees held the last of the light in their upper branches, while the ground beneath them went dark. The middle bench sat empty. The book was still there, left when the cuffs went on, sitting on the wooden slats with the spine up and the pages spread open in the early evening air. Chapter 11. The place where Dion had been when a shadow crossed the grass and the after changed direction. James Baldwin. Waiting to be finished. The weekend passed the way bad weekends do. Slowly and all at once. Dion spent Saturday at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold 3 times before he stopped noticing. His sister called at 11 in the morning. He watched the phone light up with her name and let it go to voicemail. Not because he didn't want to talk to her. Because he didn't know yet what he would say. Kishisas had a particular gift for asking the one question he wasn't prepared for, and right now there were too many of those stacked up in no particular order. He made eggs, ate half of them, put the plate in the sink, and left it there. He opened the Baldwin. Read 12 pages of chapter 11 before he realized he hadn't absorbed any of them. Closed it again. Put it on the coffee table where he could see it. He wasn't agitated. That was the thing people misread about him, even people who had worked beside him for years. They expected anger, expected the sharp, combustible response that comes from being done wrong in a way that's undeniable. And the anger was there. He wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But underneath it was something quieter and harder to name. Not resignation, not peace. Something more like a stone that had been sitting in cold water for a very long time. Heavy, still, and dense enough that nothing bounced off it. He thought about the bench, about the specific sequence of Callahan's hands, the way they had moved to the holtos first and toward with the cuff second, the order of that. What it said about what Roy Callahan's body believed before Roy Callahan's mind had finished forming its justification. He thought about Greer's face at the booking desk, that particular stillness. He thought about the two closed files in Holt's folder. The same signature, twice, on documents that should never have been closed. He was still thinking about all of it on Sunday morning when his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Unknown number. He almost left it, then opened it. A text. "Hey, my name is Tyler. I was in the park on Friday. I found the FBI website, and I hope it's okay that I'm texting. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. I'm sorry I didn't do anything. I didn't know what to do." Dion read it once, then again, set the phone face down on the table, picked up his coffee, looked out the kitchen window at the alley behind his building, where someone's had left a broken office chair 3 weeks ago. Still there, slowly going to rust, waiting for someone to decide it was their responsibility. He turned the phone back over. Read the message a third time. 14 years old, maybe 15. First instinct after 2 days was to apologize for not doing enough. He pressed his knuckles briefly against his mouth, sat with that for a moment. Then he typed, "Tyler, you did exactly right. You stayed, you watched, you reached out. That's more than most people do. I'm fine. Don't apologize." He stopped. Added one more line. "Thank you for asking." Sent it, set the phone down, picked up the Baldwin. Read until the third cup of coffee went cold. Monday came like Mondays do, without warning. Despite all available evidence that it was coming, Captain Brenda Holt arrived at the precinct at 6:45. She had done this every Monday for 11 years. The building was quiet at that hour. Overnight shift finishing up, day shift not yet fully assembled. She valued those 45 minutes. They were the only ones in the week that were entirely hers. Not today. Lou Peterson was already there when she walked in, standing at the coffee machine with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had been rehearsing something since Saturday. "Morning, Captain." "Lou, there was some excitement Friday." She poured her coffee, kept her eyes on the machine. "Did you?" Callahan mentioned it. A pause, timed. Guy turned out to be some kind of federal employee. "Some kind," she said. "I'm just saying." Callahan was doing his job. Alert came in, the man fit the description. He followed through. "That's protocol." Holt put the pot down, turned to face him. Peterson was not a physically small man, and he had a way of occupying space that went beyond the physical. He'd learned early that presence was its own argument, and he'd been making that argument for 15 years. She looked at him the way she'd looked at Callahan on Friday, without hurry, without anything that could be read as uncertainty. "Lou," she said, "this conversation isn't happening right now, I just think. Not right now." She picked up her cup and walked to her office, closed the door, stood behind it for a moment with one hand flat on her desk. Peterson hadn't shown up early to make coffee. He'd shown up early to take the temperature of things, to assess what could still shaped before the formal process took over. She'd known Lou Peterson for 8 years, and she understood exactly what that early arrival meant. She sat down, opened her laptop. The internal review request she'd filed Friday evening had already generated a row of responses. HR. Legal. The union's liaison had sent an email at 7:02 on Sunday morning, which told her precisely how fast Callahan had made a phone call after she'd sent him home. And there was one from the FBI field office. A formal notification of participation in the review process. Professional. Measured. With the specific tone of an institution that was paying attention. She read it twice, then sent an email to Dion Mays. "Mr. Mays, the formal review has been initiated. I'd like to meet with you today if possible. There are developments you should be aware of." Holt, his reply arrived 11 minutes later. "I'll be there at 10. Greer got in at 7:30. He'd slept somewhere between 4 and 5 hours. Spent most of Sunday night running the same calculation repeatedly and getting the answer every time, which was not the answer he wanted, but was not going to change regardless of how many times he ran it. The calculation went like this. 9 months on the job. A lease. Student loans. A mother in Ohio who had stopped worrying about him approximately she'd decided he'd found his footing. Against all of that, 4 paragraphs in a substantial report. Filed Friday evening. Submitted directly to Captain Holt before he left the building. He sat down at his desk, turned on his computer, pulled up the report to read it one more time, and then Lou Peterson materialized at his elbow. The man had a gift for appearing without announcing himself. Greer had noted this in his first week, and had never stopped noticing it. "Morning, Greer. Sergeant. Hell of a Friday." Peterson leaned against the neighboring desk. At ease, unhurried. The posture of a man having a casual conversation that happened to be neither. "Callahan's a solid officer, you know that. 24 years. Good instincts. Good record." "Sure," Greer said. His eyes stayed on his screen. "These things happen. Someone fits a description, you follow up. That's the job." A beat. Waited. The thing about written reports is that precision matters. You say something the wrong way, it creates an impression that doesn't reflect what actually occurred. "You follow me?" Greer followed him completely. He turned and looked at Peterson directly, which he had been careful not to do until now. "Are you asking me to change what I wrote?" he said. Peterson spread his hands, open, reasonable. "I'm talking about accuracy. My report is accurate." The silence that followed had weight in it. The kind communicated something without saying it. "You're new," Peterson said. Almost gentle. The gentleness of someone explaining something to a person they consider not yet fully formed. "There's a way things work here. You'll learn it." He pushed Tut off from the desk. Walked to the coffee machine as if that had been his destination the whole time. Greer turned back to his screen. His hands were still on the keyboard. He'd learned in 9 months to keep his hands still when Peterson was nearby, because stillness read as compliance, and compliance kept things from becoming problems, and problems were what you couldn't afford when you were new. He thought about a man sitting on a bench in a park. He thought about a line he'd written it in a notebook 8 months ago, in a seminar room downtown. "The evidence you don't document is the decision you've already made." He opened a new document and began writing the supplemental addendum. The clip appeared Monday morning. Nobody could say exactly when or where it originated. That was the nature of these things. They didn't start somewhere specific. They arrived, already everywhere, already by thousands of people before you knew they existed. 43 seconds. Filmed on a phone from roughly 30 feet away. The image slightly unsteady. Wind noise on the audios, some traffic in the background. But clear enough. A man on a bench, reading a book. Then an officer walking across the grass toward him. A conversation too quiet to make out. And then the man standing and turning and the handcuffs going on. 43 seconds. By noon, it had 60,000 views. By 2 in the afternoon, 120,000. By the time the Public Affairs Office called Holt at 3:15, it had been shared more than 1,500 times, and 3 local news stations had submitted requests for comment. The man in the video was not identified. Neither was the officer. But the 14th Precinct's address appeared in the comments section within 2 hours of the first post, added by an account created 4 days earlier with no profile photograph and no other activity. Holt's phone rang 6 times in the hour after the public affairs call. She answered 3 of them. Dion was already in her office when the call came in. He sat across from her desk with a legal pad he hadn't written anything on. He'd arrived at 10, as promised, and they'd spent the first 40 minutes going through the structure of the formal review. Timeline, participants, what the board would examine, and in what order. Practical, methodical. The kind of conversation that required precision and left no room for imprecision. Then her phone rang and she excused herself for 4 minutes, and when she came back, she told him about the video. He was quiet. "How many views?" he said. "As of an hour ago, 140,000, and nobody's identified me yet." "Not yet. Your face is visible, but the distance makes it difficult. Most of the comments are." She paused, finding the right word. "Emotional." "I imagine they are." He looked at the window, not through it. At the glass itself, the way a person looks at something when they're really looking at something else entirely. I don't want it out yet, he said. Dion, I'm asking you to hold the identification for now. Whoever that boy is, he posted a video of a man being handcuffed in a park for sitting on a bench. That's what people are responding to. A man, not an agent, not a federal title. He turned from the window. The moment my position comes out, that becomes the headline. FBI agent wrongfully arrested, which makes the problem sound like the error. Not the reason the error was possible in the first place. Holt was quiet, thinking it through. You understand the difference, he said. I do. She turned her pen over in her hand once. I don't know how long I can hold it. Long enough to finish the review the right way. She looked at him. He looked back, and there was nothing negotiable in his expression, but there was also nothing aggressive. Just the clarity of a man who had thought this through before he walked in the door. All right, she said, but Callahan comes in today. He needs to see the footage. Agreed. And I'll be scheduling time with Peterson separately. I know. A pause, quieter. He won't make it easy. No, she said. Callahan came in at noon. He looked like a man who had spent the weekend sleeping too much and resting not at all. The particular exhaustion that lives in the face, not the body. He sat across from Holt with his hands on his knees and a set to his jaw that said he'd made some decisions about how this conversation would go. She had him arrange his posture. Then she opened a laptop on the desk between them and pressed play. He watched the clip, all 43 seconds. She watched him watch it. His face stayed controlled, professional. But around the 20-second mark, his hands tightened on his knees and didn't release. When it ended, she closed the laptop. That's what 60,000 people saw by lunchtime, she said. That's not the whole picture. Roy, I followed the alert. I had reason to believe. Roy, same word, same volume. The flatness of it more effective than any raised voice. He stopped. What do you see, she said, when you watch that video? A long silence. Not the silence of a man thinking. The silence of a man who knows the answer and is negotiating with himself about whether to say it. A man on a bench, he said finally. The words came out rough, like they'd traveled somewhere difficult before reaching his mouth. A man reading a book, she said. He said nothing. I need you to watch something else. She set up the body camera footage on a second device. Pushed it across the desk to him. I'm going to leave you alone in here, nobody else. Just you and this. She tapped the screen once. Come find me when you're ready. She stood. Walked to the door. Roy. He looked up. Try to remember the last time you sat on a bench somewhere, and nobody gave it a second thought. She left. The footage ran 42 minutes. Callahan sat with it alone in Holt's office for an hour and 25 minutes. Nobody went in. The officer who brought water around the 90-minute mark knocked first, waited, then opened the door and found Callahan sitting with his hands in his lap. The screen had gone dark. He wasn't watching it anymore. He was sitting in the quiet of the office with an expression the young officer later described, hesitantly, as like something had gone out of him. Not angry, not sad, exactly. Just out. When Callahan came out, he didn't go to Holt. He went to the men's room. Was in there for several minutes. Came out. Walked to the back of the building and sat in the break room with a cup of coffee he poured and did not drink. Nobody approached him. Peterson tried once. Got one look from Callahan and turned back the way he'd come. Because something had shifted in Callahan's face that made the usual conversation impossible. Not guilt. Not yet. Something earlier than guilt. The expression of a man who has just for the first time in a long time heard himself say something in a voice he recognized as his own, and is sitting with what that means. At 2 o'clock, Greer submitted his supplemental report. He'd spent the equivalent of 5 hours across the weekend on 4 paragraphs. Not because the writing was difficult, because each sentence required him to be exact. To say precisely what he had seen and done and not done, in the order it occurred, without softening any of the edges to make it easier to read. He wrote that he had recognized the name Dion Mays from the multi-agency training seminar months prior. He wrote that he had confirmed the identity through the Federal Building Directory before formal booking was complete. He wrote that this confirmation occurred while Mr. Mays was still on the processing bench, meaning the situation could have been addressed at that point. He wrote that Sergeant Louis Peterson had approached him shortly after and suggested, without direct instruction, that precision of wording in incident reports was a matter of interpretation. He submitted to Captain Holt, copied HR, copied the internal review file. Then he sat back and noticed that his hands were not entirely steady. Not badly, but enough that he put them flat on the desk and left them there. He thought about his mother in Ohio, about the student loans, about 9 months of being careful. Then he stopped thinking about those things. The hands steadied. He picked up the next piece of paperwork on his desk and kept working. Peterson found out about the supplemental report at 3 o'clock. The way people in precincts always find things out, not through official channels, but through the low-frequency signal that runs a building where people work in close quarters for too many years. Someone mentions something to someone else, and the information moves the way information moves in closed spaces, faster than anyone intends. Through gaps nobody designed. He didn't go to Greer. He knew better. He could see from across the floor, in the set of Greer's shoulders and the deliberate way the young man had been all afternoon. Straight-backed, present in a way that was different from his usual careful invisibility. That the 4 paragraphs were already filed and nothing said now would reach them. He went to his desk instead, sat down, stared at his computer screen without seeing it. He thought about Roy Callahan, 24 years, 3 commendations. Roy, who drove you home from the hospital when your knee gave out and showed up without being asked when there was a death in the family and never made you feel like either thing was an imposition. Roy, who was the first person Peterson had trusted in this building and had kept trusting through everything, because that was what loyalty meant when you'd been doing this long enough. And Roy had filed 2 complaints against him in 18 months, and both times Peterson had picked up the folder and made it smaller, had made calls, had used words like misunderstanding and resolved internally and let's not make this bigger than it is. He'd done it because Roy was his friend. That sentence had always been complete when he said it in his head. Roy was his friend, so he'd protected him, full stop. He opened his email, started typing, deleted it, picked up his desk phone, set it back down. He thought about Brennan, his son, 19 years old, studying out in the western part of the state, home for Thanksgiving last year with opinions that had surprised Lou in ways he hadn't been prepared for. And they'd argued at the dinner table for 3 minutes about things Lou had thought were already settled, while his wife refilled everyone's water glass because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. Lou had been sure he was right, certain of it at the time. The certainty of a man who has operated from the same set of assumptions for so long that the assumptions no longer feel like assumptions. They feel like ground. Brennan had said, "You've never been on the other side of it, Dad. You don't actually know what it feels like." And Lou had said, "I know how to do my job, Bren." And Brennan had said, "That's not what I'm talking about." And Lou had refilled his own water glass because he also didn't know what else to do with his hands, and the conversation had ended not with resolution but with the specific discomfort of 2 people who love each other and have reached the edge of what they can bridge that evening. About a month before this Friday, Brennan had called on a Thursday evening. His voice was controlled in the particular way it got when he was managing something he hadn't expected to be managing. He'd been driving back to school on the highway. No violation stated. Asked to step out of the car, made to wait on the shoulder while the officer ran his plates. Twice. 22 minutes total. Then the officer drove away, without explanation, without apology, without a word. Brennan hadn't been angry on the phone. That was the thing that had stayed with Lou more than anything else. He'd been tired. 19 years old. A good kid. A kid who'd done everything right. And tired in a way that had no business being in a voice that young. and Lou Peterson, sitting at his kitchen table listening to his son describe standing on the shoulder of a highway, while someone treated him like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be spoken to. Lou had recognized that tiredness. He'd seen it recently, in a man on a processing bench in his own precinct, hands cuffed behind his back, looking at the clock on the wall with an expression that wasn't angry and wasn't frightened, but carried a specific weight that Lou's was only now learning to name. The tiredness of someone who has been carrying something for so long that the surprise has worn off, who no longer expects to be surprised, who has simply learned to wait. Lou stared at his desk, and for the first time since Friday, for the first time, if he was being honest, in longer than Friday, something cracked in him. Not dramatically, not with any sound or visible sign, just a line developing in old material. The way wood splits along its grain before it gives. Almost invisible from the outside, but structural, real. The kind of crack that once it starts doesn't stop. He sat with it for a long time. At 4 o'clock, Holt called everyone into the second-floor conference room. Not formally. Not yet. A preliminary conversation before the review board convened later in the week. The room had a long table, a window facing the parking lot, and fluorescent lights that flickered once when they came on and then held. Callahan came in and sat on one side of the table. Peterson took the chair beside him, leaving a gap between himself and the wall that he didn't seem to notice. Greer sat at the far end, alone, his notepad in front of him, not looking at either of the others. Dion was already there when they arrived, sitting at one end of the table with a legal pad and a pen. The legal pad was blank. He hadn't been told where to sit. Nobody corrected him. Holt took the seat across from him, looked at the room once, the way a person looks at a thing before they begin the work of it. "Let's start," she said. The conversation lasted 90 minutes and went the way these conversations go when they are going badly, and no one has yet decided how much badly they are willing to acknowledge out loud. Callahan said he had followed protocol. Holt said protocol and correct were not the same thing. Callahan said the description matched. Holt said the description matched a large portion of the district's adult male population. Callahan said he had used his judgment. And Dion, who had been quiet for the first 20 minutes, said, "What does that mean?" Judgment. Callahan looked at him for the first time since entering the room. Experience. 24 years of it. Of what, specifically? A pause. Reading situations. And what did you read on Friday? Dion's voice was level, unhurried. The voice he'd developed over 20 years, of asking questions he already knew the answer to, questions that weren't really requests for information but invitations for a person to hear themselves. When you walked across that park, what told you there was a problem? Callahan said nothing. "Walk me through it," Dion said. "You saw a man on a bench. What was the problem?" Callahan stopped. He was what? He was just another stop. The sentence couldn't find its ending because the ending didn't hold up. "He was sitting there," Dion said. "Reading, on a Friday afternoon in a public park that has been there for 40 years. There was an alert that you said yourself described a large portion of the men in this district." Dean didn't raise his voice, didn't lean forward, just kept moving in the same direction with the same pace. Was there anything, any action, any statement, any observable behavior that indicated a crime had been or was being committed by that man, on that bench? A silence that had weight. "No," Callahan said, flat, final, like something he'd been carrying at arm's length and had finally just set on the floor. The room held that word. Greer was looking at his notepad. Peterson was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man who is looking at something that isn't the table. And Callahan was looking at his own hands resting on the surface. Not in the way a person normally glances at their hands. In the way you look at something you've used your entire life that you are suddenly, in this moment, actually seeing. "Roy," Holt said. He looked up. "Why did you approach him?" Roy Callahan, some of three commendations, re 24 years, 24-year teen moving and drove you home when you couldn't drive yourself, sat in a room with people who were going to write down what he said and could not answer that question. Not because he didn't know, because knowing it quietly to himself and saying it in a room where it would be documented were two entirely different things. And he wasn't there yet, but he was closer than he'd been on Friday. When Greer's turn came, he stayed seated. He'd considered standing, then sat back down, because standing would have echoed what Peterson had done, and Greer didn't want to echo Peterson. Sometimes the right posture is simply the one that doesn't mean anything extra. He said what he'd written, every word. He didn't add and didn't subtract, just moved through it in order, clearly, with the names where the names belonged. When he's reached the part about Peterson approaching him at his desk, he kept his eyes on Holt. When he reached the part about his own delay, he says, "That was wrong. I had the information early enough to change what happened next, and I waited. That's in the record because it should be." Holt said, "Why did you wait?" "Because I was 9 months in, and I was afraid of what follows when a new officer creates a problem for a senior one." Holt said, "And what changed?" Greer was quiet for a moment, long enough that the room paid attention to the quiet. "Someone told me once that the evidence you don't document is the decision you've already made," he said. I decided I didn't want to have already made that decision without knowing I'd made it. Nobody asked who had said that. But Dion looked at the surface of the table in front of him for a moment, and something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, but in that direction. The expressions of a person who has heard something they said come back to them transformed. Used the way it was meant to be used. The meeting ended at 5:30. Callahan left slowly with the gait of a man who had set something down in that room that he'd been carrying for a long time and wasn't yet sure how to walk without it. Peterson went ahead of him. Greer collected his notepad and left without looking at either of them. Holt and Dion stayed. "How do you read that?" she said. "Callahan's moving toward it," he said. He was looking at the door the others had walked through. "Peterson isn't there yet, but something's opened." "You think he'll get there?" "People do. Eventually. The question is always the distance between when it matters to them and when it matters to the person they've harmed." He turned to look at her. "What's the timeline on the review board?" "Thursday. The union pushed for Friday." "I'm not moving it." "Good. The video will be fully identified by then. Probably before." He nodded. He'd expected that since Sunday night when he'd first seen the view count. "Ready for it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, thinking about a book on a bench, about a text from a boy named Tyler, about a parking meter on a street outside this building that had expired hours ago. "I've been ready," he said, "for longer than I'd like to have been." That evening, Lou Peterson drove home the long way, past the park on Randall, where Brennan had played Little League for 4 seasons, the field where Lou had stood along the fence on Saturday mornings. With coffee, he never quite finished because he was too busy watching. Past the diner with the red awning where they used to go after games, Brennan ordering the same thing every time. Almost Brennan as a person who found something I disliked and committed to it. Past the high school, dark now, the parking lot empty, the building carrying the quiet of a place built for noise that has temporarily run out of people to make it. He pulled into his driveway, turned off the engine, sat. The neighborhood was doing its evening things around him, a dog being walked, a porch light coming on 2 houses down, the ordinary machinery of an ordinary Thursday. He thought about Roy Callahan looking at his hands in the conference room. The way a man who has used his hands his entire life looks at them when he's seeing them for the first time from outside himself. He thought about 2 complaint files, the calls he'd made, the specific words he'd used, misunderstanding, resolved. Let's not make this bigger. He thought about Brennan on the shoulder of a highway and the voice on the phone afterward. 19 years old. Tired. He thought about a man on a processing bench who had looked at a wall clock at 5:17 and waited with the patience of someone who had run out of surprise about waiting. He picked up his phone, found Brennan's name, sat with his thumb over the call button long enough that the screen dimmed once and he had to wake it again. Then he pressed call. 2 rings. Hey, Dad. Genuine surprise. Not unwelcome. Just unprepared. Because Lou didn't call on Monday evenings without a zin made of logistics, and calling now without a logistical reason meant the reason was something else. Hey, Bren. Lou cleared his throat. The sound of a man whose voice is about to do something he hasn't given it permission to do yet. I've been thinking about what you said when you were home at Thanksgiving, about not being on the other side of it. He stopped. The sentence needed a different entrance, and about the call you made. A month ago. From the highway. Silence on the other end. The careful kind. The kind that's listening without assuming. I think I owe you an apology, Lou said. His voice did the thing. He let it. For what I said at Thanksgiving, and for not understanding what you were telling me when you called. Either time. A pause that stretched long enough to have texture. Then Brennan said quietly, Yeah, Lou said. I think I do. Outside, the streetlights came on down the block, one after another, in sequence, each one a small thing on its own. Each one part of something larger when you saw them all together. Not a lot of light, but enough. At 9 o'clock that evening, Dion Mays sat on his couch with the Baldwin. Read for 2 hours without stopping. Chapter 11 through to the end. When he closed it, he put his hand flat on the cover for a moment. The way you acknowledge something that has finally finished. Then he looked at his phone. On the kitchen counter, where he'd left it when he came in, was a parking ticket. Orange envelope. Tucked under his windshield wiper when he'd gotten back to the car at 6:45 in the evening. Nearly 3 hours after the meter had run out. He'd seen it, taken it off the windshield, carried it inside, set it on the counter. Hadn't looked at it since. He looked at it now, $42. Issued at 6:03 p.m. He almost laughed, not bitterly, just at the smallness of it. The ordinary, entirely unremarkable smallness of a parking ticket on the worst afternoon he'd had in a long time. He set the ticket on top of the Baldwin. He'd deal with it tomorrow. No new messages from Tyler. Which was right. The kid was fine. Had done what Dion had told him he'd already done well. Stayed, watched, reached out. That was enough. He turned off the lamp, went to bed, and for the first time in 6 weeks, slept through until morning. Which was not the same as saying everything was fine. Nothing was fine yet. The review board was Thursday. The video was still out there, spreading into corners of the internet Dean would never see. Callahan had looked at his hands in a conference room, which was the beginning of something, but only that. And Peterson was on a phone in the driveway having a conversation with Hesses that was overdue by approximately 1 Thanksgiving dinner. None of it was finished. All of it was in motion. And Dion Mays, who had spent 20 years learning the difference between a thing that was over and a thing that had finally arrived at the part that mattered, lay in the dark. Let it be in motion. Thursday was coming. Thursday came in gray. Low clouds sitting close to the rooftops, the kind that don't threaten rain so much as commit to a long, colorless day. The kind of sky that makes everything underneath it feel slightly more consequential than it would under sunlight. Like the weather itself understands what the day is for. Dion was up at 5, not because he'd slept badly, he hadn't. But there's a particular kind of morning that pulls you out before the alarm. Not anxiety, not dread, something more purposeful than either. The body registering that today requires more of you than yesterday did. Requiring you to arrive before it begins. He made coffee. Drank it standing at the kitchen window, watching the alley behind his building come into focus as the darkness thinned. The broken office chair was still there, still rusting through its joints. The fabric asso on the seat had begun to separate at one corner, lifting away from the frame in a curl that would only get worse. Some things just waited until someone decided they were worth addressing. He put on his best suit, charcoal gray, which felt appropriate without being theatrical. Knotted his tie once, looked at it, untied it, did it again until it was right. Looked at himself in the mirror the way his father had taught him, not checking, Exactly. More like confirming. Like saying to whatever was looking back, hi, yes, this is who walks out that door today. His father had been precise about certain things. The knot of a tie. The polish on shoes. Not vanity. Something more considered than that. The Atlantes understanding that presentation was a language, and that some rooms would decide what you were before you opened your mouth, and you could either account for that or be surprised by it. Dion had spent his whole life accounting for it. He drove to the precinct, arrived at 7:45. The review board convened at 9. The room was on the second floor. Not the conference room from Monday's preliminary meeting. A larger, more formal one. The kind that existed for occasions when the building needed to be official about something. Long table, 8 chairs arranged along one side, 2 along the other. A city seal on the wall that nobody looked at directly, but everyone was as aware of. 5 people composed the board. 2 from internal affairs, a man named Briggs who would run the proceedings, and a younger colleague named Cutler, who had been assigned to handle documentation. Cutler had a yellow legal pad and 2 sharpened pencils and the focused demeanor of someone who understood that his buds had to capture everything without editorializing, and who intended to do exactly that. One from the union, a compact woman named Ferris, who had requested Friday and been given Thursday, and carried the residue of that irritations with her into the room. One from the city's Civilian Oversight Committee, a retired judge named Holloway, who had the measured stillness of someone who presided over rooms like this for 4 decades, and had long since stopped being surprised by what happened in them. And an agent from the FBI field office named Reese. A woman in her early 50s who had driven in from downtown, who sat with the economy of movement of someone conserving themselves for what mattered, and who had not said a single unnecessary word since she walked through the door. Dion sat on the other side of the table, alone, legal pad, pen, the charcoal suit. Callahan came in at 8:58. Suit, no tie. Sat 2 chairs down from where Peterson would be, leaving a deliberate gap between them. Peterson arrived a minute later in full uniform, pressed, every detail attended to. The uniform of a man making a statement about who he was before anyone could introduce the question of who he'd been. He sat without acknowledging the gap Callahan had left. Greer came at last among the precinct staff. He sat at the far end of the row with his notepad in front of him and the look of a man who had finished his negotiating with himself sometime Sunday evening and had not reopened the question since. Holt took the chair beside Dion, looked at the board, nodded once. Briggs set his reading glasses on his nose. His hands were steady and unhurried, the hands of a man who had run enough of these proceedings to know that rushing them was the one reliable way to ruin them. He pulled the folder in front of him. "We're going to start from the beginning," he said. "And we're going to take our time." The first hour was documentation, timeline, supporting materials. The 43-second clip played on a screen at the end of the room. Watched in complete silence by everyone present, some for the first time, some not, and the silence was different depending on which. Then portions of the body camera footage, cued by Cutler, who moved through the timestamps with precision, advancing and pausing at the moments Briggs indicated. Cutler said nothing throughout. His job was accuracy, and he performed it without comment. Then Greer's supplemental report, read aloud in full by Briggs in a voice that was professionally neutral throughout. The neutrality somehow made the content land harder. Every name where the names belonged, every timestamp, every admission, including Greer's own, stated plainly without mitigation or elaboration. Ferris raised procedural objections in the first 20 minutes. Four of them, each one delivered with the confidence of a woman who had made similar objections in similar rooms many times before. Briggs addressed each one completely without impatience, and then continued exactly where he'd been before the objection. Ferris did not raise a fifth. Then it was Callahan's turn to speak. He'd had since Friday to prepare. He had a statement in front of him. Several paragraphs on 2 pages, the language shaped carefully, the kind of careful that happens when someone with legal training has helped build it sentence by sentence. He looked at it for a long moment, then he folded it in half, set it to the side, looked at the board. I followed an alert, he said. That's true. The description was vague. I knew it was vague. I've been doing this long enough to know that 4 data points cover most of the district on any given day. I told myself I was following protocol. He stopped, cleared his throat, but protocol was what I reached for after I'd already decided. Not before. Briggs said, "What did you decide?" "Before the protocol." And Callahan said, in a room full of people who were going to put it in a document that other people would read, in a voice that had nothing performative left in it, that he didn't belong there. Silence. On what basis? Briggs said. None. The word was flat, final. The sound of something that has been carried a long distance and set down. There was no basis. He was on a bench in a public park, reading. He wasn't doing anything wrong. I walked over there because of what he looked like, and I told myself it was something else. And it wasn't. Cutler wrote it down, all of it, every word. The room held the silence for a moment. Holloway, the retired judge, wrote something in his notebook without looking up. Reese, from the FBI, looked up from hers for the first time since proceedings had begun. Ferris, to her considerable credit, did not move to interrupt her client. She sat with her hands folded on the table and let him say the things she'd specifically told him not to say, because she had been doing this long enough to recognize the moment when a person has decided to tell the truth, and she knew that the only thing that makes such a moment worse is attempting to stop it. Dion looked down at his legal pad. In the margin, small and private, he wrote one word, there. The first hour was documentation. Timeline. Supporting materials. The 43C slip played on a screen at the end of the room. Watched in complete silence by everyone's present, some for the first time and some not, and the silence was different depending on which. Then the body camera footage, not all 42 minutes. Selected portions, cued by Cutler, shown with the timestamp visible in the corner. Briggs narrated nothing. Let it speak. Greer's supplemental report read aloud in full. Briggs's voice was professionally neutral throughout, and somehow the neutrality made the content land harder. Every name, every timestamp, every admission of delay and the reason for it, and the reason it ended. Ferris, the union representative, had raised procedural objections in the first 20 minutes. 4 of them. Briggs addressed each one completely, without impatience, and then continued exactly where he'd been. Ferris stopped after the 4th. Then it was Callahan's turn to speak. He'd had since Friday to prepare a statement. 7 paragraphs on 2 pages. These language careful in the way. Language gets careful. Someone with legal training has helped shape it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he folded it in half, set it aside, looked at the board. I followed an alert, he said. That's true, and the description was vague. I knew that. I've been doing this long enough to know that 4 data points cover most of a district. I told myself I was following protocol. He stopped, cleared his throat, but protocol was what I reached for after I'd already decided. Not before. Briggs said, "What did you decide before the protocol?" And Callahan said, in a room full of people who were going to put it in a document that other people would read, that he didn't belong there. Silence. On what basis? Briggs said. None. The word came out flat and final, like something carried a long distance and finally put down. There was basis. He was on a bench in a public park, reading. He wasn't doing anything wrong, and I walked over there because of what he looked like, and I told myself it was something else. A pause. It wasn't. The room held that. Ferris, to her credit, did not move to interrupt him. She sat with her hands folded on the table and let her client say the things she'd specifically advised him not to say. Because some things, once a person has decided to say them, cannot be stopped, and trying only makes it worse. Holloway, the retired judge, wrote something in his notebook. Reese, from the FBI, wrote something in hers. Dion looked down at his legal pad. In the margin, small and private, he wrote one word, there. Then it was Peterson's turn. He stood up to speak. Nobody else had stood. But Peterson had been talking on his feet for 30 years, and some habits run deeper than a Thursday morning in a formal room can reach. He held his prepared statement. He'd worked on it since Saturday. He and the union council going through it, line by line, every word weighed. The Zhang was designed to acknowledge without conceding, to explain without excusing. It was a careful document. It represented hours of work. He looked at the wall above the board's heads, some point in the middle distance. He began reading, measured, constructed. He described his role, his tenure, his decision to close the 2 prior complaints as matters resolved within the unit. He used phrases like judgment call and within established practice and in the best interests of unit cohesion. 3 paragraphs in, he stopped. The room waited. He looked down at the paper in his hand. Then he set it on the table. "I have a son," he said. Nobody moved. 19 years old. Goes to school about 4 hours from here. Peterson's voice was level, but levelness had cost him something by this point, and the cost was becoming audible. About a month ago, he was driving back to school, and he got pulled over on the highway. No violation stated. Nothing. He was asked to get out of the car. He waited on the shoulder for 22 minutes while the officers ran his plates, then ran them again. He paused. Nothing was found. The officer drove away without a word. My son called me that night, and another pause. He wasn't angry. He was tired, in a way I hadn't heard in his voice before. 19 years old, tired like that. Peterson looked down at the table in front of him. I've been closing complaint files for 15 years when they were inconvenient. I told myself that was loyalty. To the unit, to the people I'd worked beside long enough that protecting them felt like part of the job. He glanced at Callahan briefly, then away. But what happened to my son on that highway was the same thing Roy did to the man in that park. And I spent 2 years making sure nobody had to answer for the first 2 times Roy did it here. He folded his hands on the table in front of him. I'm responsible for those 2 files. I'm not going to say otherwise. The silence that followed was different from the other silences in that room that morning. Fuller, the kind that happens when something true has been said in front of people and everyone present is separately and privately deciding what to do with it. Holloway set down his pen. Reese wrote something in her notebook, slowly and deliberately. Cutler, who had been recording everything without editorial response for the entire morning, paused his writing for the first time, then continued. Dion looked at Peterson across the table. Peterson didn't return the look, but he sat with the awareness of it the way a man sits with something he has determined he deserves. Not performing acceptance of it, just letting it be there. When Greer's turn came, he stayed his seat. He'd thought about standing. Sat back down. Standing would have echoed Peterson, and Greer didn't want to echo anything in this room. The right posture is simply the one that doesn't carry extra meaning. He said what he'd written. All of it, in order, without additions or subtraction. When he reached the part about Peterson at his desk, he kept his eyes on Briggs. When he reached the part about his own delay, he said, that was wrong. I had information that could have changed what happened next, and I sat on it. That's in the record because it should be. Briggs said, why did you sit on it? Because I was 9 months in and I understood what happened to officers who created problems for people who'd been here 24 years. Briggs said, and what changed? Greer was quiet for a moment. Someone told me once that the evidence you don't document is the decision you've already made, he said. I decided I didn't want to have already made that decision without knowing I'd made it. Briggs made a note. Did not ask who had said that. Across the table, Dion looked at the surface of the wood in front of him for a long moment. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, but in that territory. The expression of a person who has heard their own words come back to them, used exactly the way they were meant to be used. The board took a recess at 11:30. An hour, Briggs said. Probably an hour. The rooms dispersed. People moved into the hallway and downstairs and toward the coffee machine with the aimless purposefulness of people who cannot hurry what they're waiting for. Dean went to the window at the end of the second-floor hallway, stood looking out at the parking lot below. The gray sky, the row of cars, a pigeon working the edge of the curb with great commitment. He heard footsteps. Knew before he turned that it was Callahan. There was something recognizable in the pace now, the specific weight of it. Roy stopped several feet away, not close, not far. The distance two people stand when a conversation needs to happen, and neither of them is certain the other one is ready for it. "I know it's not enough," Callahan said. Dion kept his eyes on the parking lot. "What isn't? What I said in there." "I know it's not." He stopped, tried the sentence from a different angle. "I know it doesn't fix anything." "No," Dion said. "It doesn't fix anything." He turned then, looked at Callahan directly. "It's a start." Callahan looked at the floor. 24 years. "I've been doing this for 24 years, and I always thought I understood the difference between a gut feeling and a bias." He stopped. "I thought they felt different." "They don't," Dion said. "That's the entire problem. They feel exactly the same. From the inside." Callahan absorbed that. "So how do you know which one it is?" he said. "Both. You ask yourself what evidence would change your mind. What the person in front of you could say or do that would make you see them differently. If the answer is nothing, if you've already reached the conclusion and you're just looking for the paperwork to support it, then it's not instinct." Dion looked at him steadily. "It's something else." Callahan was quiet. The hallway was empty around them. Somewhere below, a door opened and closed. Traffic sounds came through the glass, muffled and steady. "I walked over to that bench," Callahan said, "and I already knew. Before I said a word to you. I already knew what was going to happen. I just needed the conversation to give me something to point to." He said it slowly, like he was discovering the shape of it by saying it out loud. "And when it didn't, I kept going anyway." "Yes," Dion said. "You did." Callahan looked at him. Something in his face asked a question he didn't know how to form in words. "I want to show you something," Dion said. He took out his phone, opened the messages, found Tyler's thread, held the phone out. Callahan took it. "Read the exchange." The message from the boy. Dion's reply. "Read it again, the way you read something that requires you to feel it before you can understand it." He handed the phone back. "The kid from the park. The kid from the park." Callahan looked out the window. At the gray parking lot. At nothing in particular. "He apologized," Callahan said. "A 14-year-old kid apologized to you for not doing enough." "Yes." "Why are you showing me this?" Dion put the phone in his pocket. "Because I want you to understand why I didn't stay quiet. Not because of my title. Not because of the review board or the two files in Holt's folder, though those matter." He looked at Callahan with the same directness he'd maintained since Friday afternoon on a bench in the park. Because a boy watched what happened, and his first instinct was to apologize for his own helplessness. At 14. And I'm not willing to let that be the lesson he carries. Callahan said nothing. "I want him to know that when something is wrong, saying so has a chance of mattering. That the system can look at itself honestly sometimes, that it's worth staying." Dion straightened his jacket. "That's all. I don't need everything fixed in one Thursday morning. I just need that to be true enough that a 14-year-old boy can believe it." Callahan stood with that for a long moment. Then he nodded once. The slow nod of a man receiving something he'd needed for a long time and was only now letting himself take. The board reconvened at 12:50. The hour had extended to 90 minutes. Nobody acknowledged it. Briggs put on his reading glasses. Opened the folder. The room settled, he read the findings. His voice held the same professional neutrality it had carried all morning. The tone of a man understands that the weight of what he's saying should come from the content, not from how he delivers it. The findings took 14 minutes. Roy Callahan. Termination effective immediately. The conduct constituted racial profiling without evidentiary basis. His 24 years of service were entered into the record. They were not sufficient to alter the finding. Lupe Peterson. suspension without pay, pending independent investigation into the handling of 2 prior complaints. Additional findings to follow upon completion of that investigation. Wade Greer. Formal commendation entered into record. The delay in initial reporting was noted and weighed against the ultimate disclosure, the supplemental addendum, which Briggs described as thorough and professionally principled, and the documented pressure Greer had faced. The commendation stood. Ferris did not object to Callahan's termination. Everyone in the room understood what that silence meant. When Briggs finished, he removed his reading glasses, held them in one hand, looked at the room with the unhurried attention of a man who has been doing this for a long time and has learned that the moment after the reading matters as much as the reading itself. This board also recommends a comprehensive review of bias awareness and de-escalation training protocols at this precinct and across the district, he said. The recommendation will be forwarded to the appropriate oversight bodies. We would further recommend that Captain Holt's office collaborate with the FBI field office in designing that review. He looked at Holt, then at Dion. If both parties are willing, Holt said we are. Dion said yes. Briggs nodded, closed the folder. We're adjourned. The room began to move. Callahan stood slowly, the way a person stands when their body is waiting for the mind to confirm what it just heard. Then he buttoned the middle button of his jacket. One button, the same gesture Dion had watched him make when he crossed the at Harlan Square nearly a week ago, and looked at Holt. Captain, he said. Roy, she said. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, didn't turn around. I'm going to try to understand it, he said. To the air in the room, to whoever was willing to receive it. I don't know yet if I'll get there, but I'm going to try. He walked out. The door settled closed. Nobody spoke, because there was nothing to say to that which would improve it. It was not enough, and it was not nothing, and it was where Roy Callahan was, and where a person is the only place from which they can begin. Peterson left a few minutes later. He stopped at Greer's chair. Greer looked up. His face didn't move, but his shoulders prepared for something. Peterson said, "You did the right thing." He said it in the voice of a man paying the actual cost of a sentence, not the performative one. The kind of statement that requires you to mean it, which requires you to have arrived somewhere you didn't used to be. Greer said nothing, nodded once. Peterson walked out, and Greer sat alone in the room after everyone else had gone. The long table, the 8 empty chairs, the city seal on the wall, the fluorescent considering as it always did, whether to flicker. He thought about his mother in Ohio. He thought about student loans. He thought about 9 months of being very careful. Then he picked up his notepad, put his pen behind his ear, and went back to his desk. Holt found Dion outside. Around the side of the building, near the parking structure, there was a concrete bench that nobody used for any official purpose. He was sitting on it with his jacket still buttoned and his tie still straight, looking at the parking lot with the expression of a man who has completed a long and necessary thing, and is sitting with the weight of its completion. She came out with 2 cups of coffee, set one beside him without asking, sat down. "How are you doing?" she said, asking like a person or like a captain. "Pick one." He picked up the coffee, tired. "Yeah." She wrapped both hands around her own cup. What happened in there today was real. What Callahan said, what Peterson said. That doesn't usually happen. I know it matters. I know that, too. He looked at the parking lot. A pigeon investigating the edge of a drain with complete commitment. It doesn't change the fact that I sat in handcuffs for 90 minutes because a man looked at me and finished the sentence before he started it. No, she said, it doesn't. It doesn't change what that boy in the park is carrying now. No. He was quiet for a moment. It's a start, Toss said. The words heavier than they'd been in the hallway with Callahan. More honest about the distance between what a start is and what it needs to become. Holt turned her cup in her hands. I meant what I said in there, about the training review. I know you did. I want your involvement to be real. Not a line in a document. He looked at her. You think I'd do it any other way? No. That's exactly why I'm asking instead of assuming. He finished the coffee. Thursday of next week, I'll send you a framework. I'll have Greer on coordination. Good. He set the cup down between them. He's going to be a good officer. He already is, she said. He just needed to find out. They sat in the gray October air. The pigeon at the drain had found what it was looking for and left. The identification's been out since this morning, Holt said. Your name and title are in several pieces as of 6 a.m. I saw it. Barrett sent me 17 messages. What did you tell him? That I'd handle it. He stood, straightened his jacket, the same jacket from Friday, retrieved from the precinct's lost and found on Tuesday, bagged and labeled and handed to him in a plastic bag like the evidence it was. I have a report to finish, 6 weeks overdue. She looked up at him. The case from before all this. It'll still be there. She almost smiled, almost. Brenda. He said her first name directly, which acknowledged something between them that didn't need to be named to be real. Thank you for doing this the right way. She met his eyes. Thank you for making us. He walked toward the parking lot. Not to his car yet. He'd known since Monday that this stop needed to happen in a particular order. The review first, then this. Some things need the right sequence, or they don't hold what they're supposed to hold. 6 blocks north. He parked on the street, fed the meter. More quarters this time, enough for 3 hours. He wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. Walked through the iron gate that still needed oiling. Harlan Square on a Thursday afternoon was quieter than a Friday. Different quality of light. Sharper, the shadows more defined between the oak trees. A woman doing slow stretches on the walking path. The 2 old men from the chess table not yet arrived. Dion walked to the middle bench, stood in front of it. The book, of course, was gone. 6 days is in a public park. It was somewhere. A trash bin, someone's bag, someone's nightstand, being read by a stranger who had no idea what it had on this dish, and wouldn't until much later, if ever. He reached into his jacket pocket. He'd stopped at Ruth Ann's place on the way, the bookstore on Delaney, 40 years on the same corner. She'd recognized him when he walked in, didn't say anything about the news, just found him the book and rang it up and said, "Good to see you, baby," the way she always said it, which was exactly enough. He sat down on the bench, felt the wood under him, the cold of October through the suit jacket. The surface smooth in the center from years of use, rougher toward the edges where people sat less. He thought about his father, Theodore Mays, Southside his whole life, became a welder, raised Dion and Keisha 4 blocks from here, died at 61 of a heart attack that everyone who loved him attributed, in some part, to the accumulated weight of being a black man who had done everything right his entire life and still had to prove it to someone new every few weeks. His father had believed in parks, had brought Dean here on Sunday mornings, just the 2 of them, and they'd sit on a bench, and Auntie Father would read the paper, and Dean would eat a sandwich, and the world would leave them alone for a while. His father had never told him what to do if the world didn't leave him alone. Maybe because he believed it shouldn't have to be said. Maybe because he knew it would happen anyway and couldn't bring himself to prepare his son for the full weight of it while the boy was still young enough to believe otherwise. Dion opened the new copy to Chapter 11. The place where the afternoon had turned last Friday, he read. He was 20 cents into the chapter when he heard footsteps on the path. He finished his sentence, then looked up. Wade Greer, in uniform, walking the perimeter of the park with a measured pace of someone learning a new route carefully. He hadn't been assigned to this beat before last Friday. He was assigned to it now. A detail Holt had presented in compassing administrative decision that sounds minor until you understand what it means. Greer saw him, slowed, stopped. They looked at each other from approximately 30 feet away. The same distance, roughly, that Callahan had stood before he started crossing the grass last Friday afternoon. Greer gave a small nod. Single, understated. The nod of someone who has no words for what is being acknowledged and has the sense not to reach for words that won't fit. Dion nodded back. Greer resumed his walk, continued along the path, rounded the far bend between the oak trees and was gone. The old man with the newspaper arrived and settled himself on the far bench, open to the middle section. The chess players came through the gate shortly after, carrying their board between them without discussion. Dion looked back at the page, found his place. Read. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning, Tyler walked through the iron gate of Harlan Square. Red hoodie, backpack, slightly too much purpose in his stride, the walks of someone who has told himself he isn't nervous, which is how you can always tell that someone is. He found the middle bench, sat down, pulled a book from his backpack, opened it, looked up once at the sky. Gray still, but lighter, the particular gray that might be deciding to become something else. Then back at the page. The chess players were at their table. The old man with his newspaper was on the far bench. The park was doing what it did. Tyler read. Nobody gave him a second glance. Nobody altered their path. Nobody stopped. He was just a boy on a bench with a book on a Saturday morning, which was the most ordinary thing in the world, which was exactly what it should be. 3 weeks after the review board, the training committee held its first meeting. 8 people in a conference room downtown. 3 from the precinct, including Greer, who arrived 7 minutes early and spent those minutes reading back through 4 pages of handwritten notes from a seminar 8 months ago. 2 from the FBI field office, Holloway from civilian oversight, who had volunteered before anyone thought to ask him, a city attorney, and an HR director from the district who had read the full review board report twice and arrived with questions already written. Dion walked in at 9 o'clock, set out his briefcase on the table, took out a stack of folders and placed them in the center, looked at the room, at Greer with his old notes, at Holloway with his measured stillness, at the faces of people who had come to this room because something had gone wrong, and they were here to figure out how to make it harder for that to happen again. We're going to start by watching something, he said. He pulled up clips on the screen at the end of the room. 43 seconds, a bench, a book, an officer crossing a lawn. He let the room sit with it in full silence. Let everyone in it feel the weight of 43 seconds. How much can happen in 43 seconds? How much had... Then he said, this is what we're here to prevent. Not the termination that followed, not the review board after that. He touched the edge of the darkened screen. The moment before the first word was spoken. When a conclusion had already been reached. That's where the work is. That's where it has always been. He looked at Greer, who was writing something down with the focused attention of a person who intends to use what he's hearing. At Holloway, who was nodding slowly in the way of someone who has waited a long time to be in a room where this particular conversation was being taken seriously. At the others, each of them here because they'd chosen to be, because they understood that showing up was the first requirement of changing something. Let's get started, Dion said. And they did. The parking ticket was paid the following Monday. $42. Wrote the checks without cell ceremony, sealed the envelope, dropped it in the mailbox on Delaney on his way to the office. Some things are just what they are. He went to work.